A racist white manager has secretly been paying a black mechanic less than his white co-workers. Even though the black man is one of the best mechanics at the shop, the manager is shocked when all of the mechanics show up in his office. The sound of clanging metal and the steady hum of engines filled the air at Greg's auto repair. Jamal Davis wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned under the hood of a rusty old Chevy. His hands moved quickly, unscrewing bolts, adjusting the engine belt, and tightening connections. It was second nature to him by now, the rhythm of repair. He could hear Miguel's voice from the next bay over, humming some tune off key, followed by the sound of a ratchet turning. "Hey, Jamal," Miguel called out, walking over with his hands in his pockets, a grin on his face. He was short and stocky, wearing his usual grease-stained coveralls and a backwards cap. "You hear about Eric?" Jamal glanced up, frowning. "What about him?" Miguel chuckled, leaning against the Chevy. "Got himself another raise." Jamal wiped his hands on a rag, tossing it aside. "Another one? Didn't he just get a bump last month?" Miguel shrugged. "Guess Greg likes his work." "Me? I'm still sitting where I was last year. How about you?" Jamal didn't respond right away. He glanced over at Eric, who was leaning against a workbench, chatting with Greg like they were old friends. Eric had been at the shop for about a year less than Jamal. Nice guy, but Jamal couldn't help but feel a little twist in his stomach at the news. "Guess Greg's got favorites," Jamal said finally, pulling himself back into focus. But the thought gnawed at him. He knew he put in more hours than Eric, worked harder, solved problems faster. The Chevy in front of him was proof. Greg had handed him this job because none of the other guys could figure it out. But another raise for Eric? Something wasn't adding up. "Don't let it get to you, man," Miguel said, slapping Jamal on the back. "You think Greg's gonna come around to us? He's been running this place the same way for years. You gotta learn to live with it, I guess." Jamal grunted in response, but he didn't like the sound of that. Live with it? He had been living with it, watching guys like Eric come in, get raises, and move up, while he stayed in the same spot. It wasn't just about the money, it was the respect, the recognition for all the sweat and hours he'd put in. He leaned into the Chevy again, hands tightening the bolts, jaw clenched. A little later, Greg strolled past, patting Eric on the shoulder, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Good work, Eric. I like how you handled that transmission job last week. Keep it up, and you might see another raise soon." Jamal's hands froze on the wrench. Another one? He felt Miguel's eyes on him, but he didn't look up. Instead, he finished the job quickly, packed up his tools, and made his way over to Miguel as the lunch break bell rang. They grabbed their sandwiches and sat down at the old picnic table out back, surrounded by the smells of oil and gasoline. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling. "Something's not right," he said, finally breaking the silence. Miguel raised an eyebrow. "What? About Eric?" "About all of it." Jamal took a bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly. "We've been here longer. We do more work. You've been fixing cars since before Eric even knew how to change his oil. And I've been taking on jobs Greg gives me that no one else can do. But we're not seeing raises." Miguel sighed, leaning back against the table. "I hear you, man. But what are we gonna do about it? Greg's got his way of running things. He don't listen to guys like us." Jamal stared at the ground. He wasn't so sure about that. If something was wrong, maybe it was time someone said something. But could he really afford to make waves? As they finished lunch, Jamal's mind kept turning. The clanging of tools in the distance and the chatter of the other mechanics blended into background noise as he thought about the next steps. Miguel didn't seem too hopeful, but this didn't sit right with Jamal, not anymore. Before he could get too deep in thought, the bell rang again, signaling the end of their break. Jamal got up, throwing his sandwich wrapper into the trash. He wasn't done thinking about this. Far from it, but he wasn't going to jump into anything without knowing the facts first. "I'm gonna look into it," Jamal said quietly as they walked back to the shop floor. Miguel gave him a look. "What do you mean?" Jamal didn't answer right away, his gaze drifting to Greg's office door. "I'm just gonna ask around, see what other guys are getting paid. See if it's just me and you or if there's a bigger problem here." Miguel hesitated but then nodded. "All right, but be careful, Jamal. Greg doesn't like guys asking too many questions." Jamal nodded. "I know, but if something's off, we deserve to know." Miguel slapped him on the back, though the grin had faded. "You're a brave man, Jamal. Just make sure you don't end up with nothing for it." Jamal didn't reply as he grabbed his tools and headed back to work. The following week, Jamal kept his eyes and ears open. As the other mechanics worked around him, he took note of every conversation, every passing comment about pay, promotions, and job performance. Something still wasn't sitting right with him, and he wasn't going to let it go until he knew the truth. One morning, while Eric was working on a truck, Jamal approached him. Eric was a lanky guy in his mid-40s, with faded jeans and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He was friendly enough, though not someone Jamal was particularly close with. But today, he needed answers. "Hey, Eric," Jamal started casually, leaning against the truck Eric was working on. I heard Greg gave you a raise the other day. Congrats, man. Eric grinned, standing up straight and wiping his hands on a rag. Yeah, thanks. I've been busting my ass around here, you know how it is. Jamal nodded. Yeah, for sure. I was curious though. How long did it take before Greg started bumping you up? You've only been here, what, a couple of years? Eric shrugged, tossing the rag aside. Yeah, about that. I don't know. Greg's fair. You put in the work, he notices. I'm sure he'll come around to you soon enough, Jamal. Just keep your head down, stay focused. You know how it goes. Jamal forced a smile, though inside the answer only fueled his suspicion. Yeah, for sure. Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Eric went back to work, but Jamal stood there for a moment thinking. Keep your head down, Eric had said. That was the problem. Jamal had been keeping his head down for years, working harder than anyone else in the shop, but he hadn't seen the kind of raises Eric was getting. He wasn't expecting handouts, but this didn't feel right. And if it wasn't just him, something had to be done. Later that afternoon, Jamal caught up with Miguel during a quiet moment in the garage. They were both leaning against a couple of cars, catching their breath after a long morning of repairs. Jamal wiped the sweat from his forehead, glancing over at Miguel. Talked to Eric earlier, Jamal said, keeping his voice low. Miguel raised an eyebrow. Yeah? What did he say? Says Greg's fair, that if you put in the work, you'll get the raises. Jamal's tone was flat, his frustration just below the surface. Miguel snorted. Fair? For who? You think Greg's ever gonna notice the work we put in? I've been here longer than Eric, and I've never seen the kind of money he's getting. Jamal shook his head, crossing his arms. That's what I'm saying. I've been doing this a long time, and I know what we're worth. It's not just you and me. I've been thinking, maybe it's time to find out what the others are getting. Miguel looked around, making sure no one was listening. You sure about that? Guys here, they don't like talking about their pay. They might get spooked. Jamal frowned. Yeah, maybe. But if we don't know where we stand, how are we supposed to do anything about it? We can't keep letting this slide. Miguel sighed, running a hand over his cap. You're right, but Greg's been running this shop the same way for years. You think he's gonna care what a couple of us have to say? Jamal didn't answer right away, his mind racing through possibilities. I don't know, but I'm not staying quiet anymore. We've worked too hard to keep getting paid less than we deserve. Miguel nodded slowly. All right, man, I'm with you, but let's be smart about it. Over the next couple of days, Jamal quietly talked to a few of the other mechanics when the shop wasn't too busy. He made sure to keep the conversations light, asking about hours, overtime, and eventually, pay. Most of the guys were hesitant at first, but once they realized Jamal was serious, they started to open up. It wasn't long before Jamal noticed a pattern. Every Black and Latino worker he talked to was making less than the white mechanics, even the newer ones. And it wasn't just a small difference. It was significant. $100 here, a couple hundred there. Over the course of a year, that added up to thousands. One afternoon, Jamal caught up with Carlos, a young mechanic who had been at the shop for a few years. He was working under the hood of a beat-up sedan when Jamal approached him. Hey, Carlos, Jamal said, leaning against the car. Got a minute? Carlos wiped his hands and stepped back from the engine, nodding. Yeah, what's up? Jamal glanced around, making sure no one was listening. I've been talking to some of the guys, trying to figure out what everyone's making, just to see where we all stand. Carlos narrowed his eyes. Why? You think something's off? Jamal nodded. Yeah, I do. I've been here a long time, and I'm noticing that guys like you, me, Miguel, we're getting paid less than some of the newer white mechanics. I've asked around, and it's not just a coincidence. Carlos's face hardened. Man, I thought it was just me. I've been feeling like I'm being shafted, but I didn't want to stir up trouble. Jamal shook his head. It's not just you. We're all in the same boat. Carlos stared at the ground for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, so what do we do about it? I'm still figuring that out, Jamal admitted. But we can't keep quiet. Greg's not going to change anything if we don't say something. Carlos sighed. You really think he's going to listen? Jamal hesitated, then said, he'll have to. If enough of us speak up, he won't have a choice. Carlos didn't look convinced, but he nodded. All right, let me know what you need. As Jamal walked back to his work bay, he felt a mix of anger and determination growing inside him. The more he learned, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about pay. It was about respect. Greg had been underpaying them because he thought he could get away with it, and that needed to change. By the end of the week, Jamal had gathered enough information to be sure. The minority workers were all being paid significantly less than their white counterparts, regardless of their experience or the quality of their work. It wasn't just an oversight. It was a pattern. Jamal shared his findings with Miguel as they packed up for the day. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot as the other workers headed home. It's worse than I thought, Jamal said quietly, leaning against his car. We're not just getting paid less. It's deliberate. Greg's been doing this for years, Miguel sighed, shaking his head. I figured as much. So what now? Jamal looked out at the fading sunlight, the quiet resolve in his voice growing stronger. We're gonna confront him. We deserve better than this. Miguel nodded, but there was a hint of worry in his eyes. I'm with you, man. But Greg's not the kind of guy who backs down easy. Jamal stood up straight, the determination clear in his stance. I know, but we can't back down either. Not this time. As the two men left the shop, Jamal knew that things were about to change. What started as a feeling of unfairness had turned into something much bigger. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone in that shop who had been mistreated, overlooked, and underpaid. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slide. The break room at Greg's auto repair was nothing fancy. Just a couple of mismatched chairs, a sticky table, and a buzzing refrigerator that always seemed to be on its last legs. It was a quiet place, away from the constant clatter of tools and the hum of engines, where the mechanics could sit down for a moment and catch their breath. Today, however, the air in the room felt heavier. Jamal sat at the table, his lunch untouched in front of him. Miguel was across from him, tapping his fingers on the edge of his soda can. They were waiting for the others. Jamal had already spoken to a few guys privately, but now, it was time to bring them all together. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly noon. Any minute now, the rest of the guys would be taking their lunch breaks and filing into the room. Soon, Carlos walked in, followed by Terrence and Luis. All of them looked a bit uneasy, like they knew something serious was about to go down, but weren't sure what to expect. They exchanged glances with each other before sitting down at the table. Jamal cleared his throat, leaning forward. Thanks for coming, guys. Jamal started, keeping his voice low. I've been talking to a few of you over the past week, and I think it's time we had a real conversation about what's going on around here. The other mechanics exchanged wary glances, but no one spoke right away. Terrence, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s, shifted in his seat. He had been at Greg's shop for almost as long as Jamal. What exactly are we talking about here, Jamal? Jamal took a deep breath, looking each of them in the eye. We're getting paid less. All of us. I've talked to nearly everyone, and it's the same story. We're putting in more hours, doing more work, and we're getting paid less than some of the newer white guys who haven't been here as long. There was a long pause. Carlos was the first to break the silence, his voice edged with frustration. I knew something was off. I've been thinking the same thing for a while now, but I didn't want to believe it. Luis, who had been sitting quietly, leaned forward. He was a young guy, barely in his 20s, with grease-streaked hands and an old cap pulled low over his eyes. It's true, I've been here for 2 years, and I've barely seen a raise, but I know guys who've only been here a year, and they're getting more than I am. Jamal nodded. That's exactly it. I thought it was just me at first. But after talking to you all, it's clear. Greg's been giving us the short end of the stick for years. Miguel leaned forward, his voice low. But what do we do about it? We can't just walk into Greg's office and demand raises. You know how he is. He'll find some excuse to get rid of us. Jamal rubbed his temples. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but the more he thought about it, the angrier he got. We can't stay quiet about this forever, though. If we don't say anything, nothing will ever change. Terrence, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. What if we all go to him together? It's harder for him to ignore all of us if we're united. Luis frowned. You really think that'll work? Greg's stubborn. I've seen him brush off complaints before. Jamal met Luis's eyes. Maybe. But he won't be able to brush us off if we're all on the same page. It's harder for him to fire everyone than to fire just 1 or 2 guys. He needs us to keep this place running. Carlos nodded slowly. Jamal's right. We've got the skills. If we stick together, maybe we can get him to listen. There was a long silence as the men mulled over the idea. Miguel sighed, shaking his head. I just don't know, man. Greg's never struck me as the kind of guy who backs down easy. Even if we all go in there, what's to stop him from just finding a new set of guys to replace us? Jamal felt the weight of Miguel's words. He had been thinking the same thing, but as he looked around the table, seeing the frustration in their faces, he knew they couldn't back down. We can't live in fear of what might happen. If we don't stand up now, Greg's gonna keep walking all over us. He thinks we're replaceable, but we know our worth. Terrence leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. So what's the plan then? Jamal took a deep breath. We all go in together. Lay out the facts, plain and simple. If Greg doesn't want to listen, then we'll have to make a choice. But we deserve better than this, and we need to make him understand that. Luis looked nervous. And what if he just laughs us off, or tells us to leave? If he does, Jamal said quietly, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But we've got to try. For too long, we've been letting him get away with this. Miguel tapped his fingers on the table, nodding slowly. All right, I'm in. But we've got to stick together on this. No backing down once we start. The other men nodded in agreement. Terrence leaned forward, his eyes steely. We're with you, Jamal. Let's do this. Jamal felt a surge of resolve. He had started this because he couldn't stand the thought of being treated unfairly any longer. Now, looking around at the men sitting with him, he knew it wasn't just about him. It was about all of them. Everyone who had been taken advantage of, everyone who had put in the hours and been shortchanged. As they wrapped up the conversation, Jamal stood, the others following his lead. "We'll go in first thing tomorrow," he said firmly. "We talked to Greg, and we don't leave until we've made ourselves heard." Miguel grinned, though there was still a hint of worry in his eyes. "You sure know how to pick a fight, Jamal." Jamal chuckled softly. "I'm not looking for a fight, just some fairness." They filed out of the break room, heading back to the shop floor as the lunch bell rang. Jamal felt a weight lift off his shoulders, though he knew the real challenge was still ahead. Tomorrow would be the day they finally confronted Greg, and no matter what happened, Jamal was ready. The morning air was thick with tension as Jamal arrived at Greg's auto repair. He pulled into the parking lot earlier than usual. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly for a moment before he let out a breath and stepped out of his truck. Today wasn't just another day at the shop. Today, they were going to confront Greg. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, casting long shadows across the asphalt, and the sound of birds filled the quiet before the day's rush. Jamal walked into the shop, his boots echoing on the concrete floor, and headed straight to his workbench. His tools were neatly arranged, like always, but he wasn't thinking about the jobs lined up for the day. His mind was on the meeting they had planned. One by one, the others showed up. Miguel came in next, his usual easy grin replaced by a more serious expression. He walked over to Jamal without saying a word, nodding briefly before he started laying out his tools. Terrence followed, his face hard and unreadable. Then Luis and Carlos, both looking tense but determined. They gathered near Jamal's bay, each of them glancing around to make sure Greg wasn't nearby. The shop wasn't officially open yet, so they had a few minutes to talk before Greg came in. "You all ready for this?" Jamal asked, his voice low but steady. Terrence cracked his knuckles. "As ready as I'll ever be." Luis shifted nervously, his eyes darting around the room. "I don't know, man. What if this blows up in our faces?" Jamal met his eyes. "It might, but we've come too far to back down now." Miguel leaned against the tool cabinet, crossing his arms. "We stick together like we said. No backing down, no getting cold feet. If one of us wavers, Greg's gonna sense it, and it'll be over before we even get started." Jamal nodded. "That's right. We go in together. We speak with one voice, and we don't give him any reason to think we're not serious." Carlos took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "So, what exactly are we gonna say?" Jamal had thought about this all night. He couldn't sleep, his mind racing with possible scenarios, what Greg might say, what they needed to do. But one thing was clear. Greg needed to see that they weren't just complaining. They were demanding what they deserved. "I'll do most of the talking," Jamal said. "But we need to let him know this isn't just about one or two of us. This is about all of us. We lay out the facts, how long we've been here, how hard we've worked, and how we're being paid less than guys who haven't even been here as long. We tell him straight, we deserve fair pay, or we're out." Luis's eyes widened. "We're out? You mean, like we're really quitting?" Jamal held his gaze. "If it comes to that, yeah, but we won't start there. We give him a chance to fix it first." Terrence chimed in. "And if he doesn't, what if he just brushes us off?" Jamal's jaw tightened. "Then we walk, all of us, together." The silence that followed was heavy. They all knew the risk. Walking out meant leaving their jobs, their steady income, and potentially putting themselves in a worse situation. But staying meant accepting less than they deserved. Miguel broke the silence. "Greg thinks he's got us all under his thumb. He thinks we won't leave because we need these jobs, but he doesn't know we're ready to stand up for ourselves. That's what'll catch him off guard." Jamal nodded. "Exactly. And if we do this right, he'll realize he can't run this place without us." Just then, they heard the familiar sound of Greg's truck pulling into the lot. The group exchanged a final glance, and Jamal could see the nervousness in their faces, but there was also resolve. This was it. Greg walked into the shop a few moments later, his usual confident stride in place. He was whistling as he made his way to his office, his tan khakis and crisp shirt a stark contrast to the grease-stained coveralls of the mechanics around him. He didn't seem to notice the group standing together by Jamal's bay. "Greg!" Jamal called out, his voice firm. Greg stopped mid-whistle, turning to face the group. "What's up, Jamal? Something wrong with the car?" Jamal took a step forward, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "We need to talk. All of us." Greg's eyes flicked to the group standing behind Jamal, his brow furrowing slightly. "Talk? About what?" Jamal didn't waste time. "About how we've been treated. We've been working here for years, putting in more hours than anyone, and we're still getting paid less than guys who've been here a lot less time. It's not right, Greg, and we deserve better." Greg's expression shifted from confusion to irritation. He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe of his office. "You're saying I don't pay you guys enough? You're lucky to have jobs, especially in this market. And if you don't like what you're getting, there's the door." The bluntness of Greg's response hung in the air for a moment. Jamal's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for what we're worth. We've been here longer. We've done more work. And we've earned more than what we're getting." Greg's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "Listen, I don't have time for this. If you think you're worth more, go find another shop that'll pay you what you think you deserve. But I run things the way I run them. And if you don't like it, you know where the exit is." Jamal could feel the tension radiating from the guys behind him, but he didn't back down. "Is that really how you want to play this, Greg? Because we're not talking about one or two of us. We're talking about all of us. You lose us. This shop doesn't run." Greg smirked, pushing off the doorframe. "You think I can't replace you? Mechanics are a dime a dozen, Jamal. You walk out, I'll just hire someone else to do your job. You're not as irreplaceable as you think." Jamal's blood boiled at Greg's arrogance, but he kept his voice calm. "Maybe you can find someone else, but they won't be us. We've kept this place running, and you know it." Greg's expression didn't change. "Last chance, Jamal. You want to stay, you stay on my terms. Otherwise, don't let the door hit you on the way out." Jamal turned to look at the others, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment of truth. He nodded, and slowly, one by one, they all nodded back. "We're done," Jamal said quietly, turning back to Greg. "Come on, guys." The group started walking toward the exit, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet shop. Greg didn't say anything as they left, but Jamal could feel his eyes on them, could hear the disbelief in the silence that followed. As they stepped into the morning sun, Jamal took a deep breath. They had done it. They had stood up for themselves. And now, whatever happened next, they had made their voices heard. The morning light was blinding as Jamal and the rest of the guys walked out of Greg's auto repair. The sounds of the shop, clanging tools, humming engines, had faded into the background, replaced by the steady thump of their footsteps against the pavement. Jamal's heart was still racing and his hands were shaking, but there was no turning back now. They had made their move, and the weight of their decision hung heavy in the air. The group stood in the parking lot, silence settling between them, as they tried to process what had just happened. Jamal glanced back at the shop, half expecting Greg to come storming out after them, but the door remained shut. No one was coming to stop them. They were really out. Terrence was the first to break the silence. He let out a low whistle, running a hand over his shaved head. "Damn, we really just did that." Miguel, who had been standing next to Jamal, let out a deep breath, his shoulders sagging. "I can't believe that fool. Mechanics are a dime a dozen? Is he out of his mind?" Jamal clenched his jaw, staring at the closed shop door. "He thinks he can replace us, just like that." Luis, still looking shaken, crossed his arms tightly over his chest. "What if he does? What if he just hires a bunch of new guys, and we're left with nothing?" Jamal turned to face him, his voice steady despite the churn of emotions in his chest. "We're not nothing, Luis. We know what we're worth. Greg's gonna realize that soon enough. The only reason that shop runs as smoothly as it does is because of us." Carlos, who had been quiet up until now, nodded in agreement. "He's been getting away with this for years because no one stood up to him. Now he knows we're serious." Terrence cracked his knuckles again, his face hard. "Yeah, but what now? We just gonna sit around and wait for Greg to come begging? What if he doesn't?" Jamal glanced around the group, feeling the weight of their uncertainty pressing down on him. This was the moment he had feared the most. Standing here, outside the shop they had all worked at for years, with no clear plan for what came next. But they couldn't turn back now. They had made their stand, and they had to keep moving forward. "I don't know what Greg's gonna do," Jamal admitted, "but we don't have to sit around and wait for him to make a move." Miguel raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" Jamal paused for a moment, the idea forming in his mind even as he spoke. "We've got the skills, right? We know how to fix cars better than anyone else in this town. If Greg won't pay us what we're worth, maybe it's time we do this for ourselves." Terrence frowned, crossing his arms. "You're talking about starting our own shop?" Jamal nodded. "Why not? We've got the experience, we've got the talent, and we've got the drive. There's nothing stopping us from building something of our own." Luis looked skeptical. "That's not exactly easy, man. We don't have the money to just open up a shop." Jamal scratched his chin, thinking, "We don't need to start big. We just need a space, a few tools, and the word'll spread. People trust us to do good work. They'll come to us." Miguel was silent for a moment, considering the idea. Then he grinned, the familiar spark returning to his eyes. "You know, that's not the worst idea I've heard, Jamal. We could make it work." Carlos nodded. "Yeah, we can make it work." Terrence sighed, shaking his head but smiling. "Well, hell, If we're gonna go out, we might as well go all in. Jamal felt a surge of determination rise in his chest. He had come into work this morning ready to confront Greg, but now, standing with his friends in the parking lot, he realized this was about more than just their paychecks. This was about taking control of their futures. We'll figure it out, Jamal said, his voice firm. We've got each other, and that's what matters. The group nodded in agreement, the tension from earlier easing just a bit as they started to talk through the details. They still had a long way to go, and there were 100 questions they didn't have answers for yet. But for the first time in a long time, they weren't just reacting to what was happening to them. They were taking action, and that made all the difference. A few hours later, the guys met up at a local diner, the chatter of customers and the smell of frying bacon filling the small space. They sat in a booth near the back, their voices low as they talked through their plans. We need a space first, Terrence said, tapping his fingers on the table. Doesn't have to be big, just somewhere we can set up a couple of lifts. Miguel nodded, chewing on his straw. I know a guy who rents out storage units. He's got a big one near downtown that might work. Could be cheap, too. Jamal leaned forward. That's a start. What about equipment? Carlos shrugged. We've got our own tools. Most of the big stuff is Greg's, but we can figure it out. Luis, still looking a bit uncertain, spoke up. And customers? We need people to come to us. Jamal smiled. We've been working on these folks' cars for years. They know us. They trust us. Once word gets out that we've started our own shop, I bet they'll follow. Terrence chuckled. And if they don't, we'll give them a reason to. Better prices, better service. We can beat Greg at his own game. Jamal nodded, feeling the excitement building. This was real. They were really doing this. As the sun set behind the diner's windows, the group finished their meal and started to make their way out. Jamal felt a sense of hope rising inside him. They had taken a huge risk, but now they had a plan. And as they parted ways for the night, Jamal couldn't help but feel like they had already won something, even if Greg didn't know it yet. As he climbed into his truck and headed home, Jamal thought about the road ahead. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be setbacks along the way. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was in control of his own fate. No more waiting around for Greg to throw them a bone. They were taking what was theirs. And tomorrow they'd start building something that was truly theirs, something no one could take away. Jamal couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Greg standing there, arms crossed, dismissing everything they'd worked for, came back to him. He kept hearing Greg's words in his head. You're all replaceable. The arrogance, the dismissal of their hard work, stung in ways Jamal couldn't shake off. The next morning, Jamal arrived at the empty lot they'd chosen as the meeting point. It was still early, the sun just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The others were already there. Miguel, Terrence, Luis, and Carlos, leaning against their cars, waiting. Everyone good? Jamal asked as he walked up. Miguel nodded, though the usual grin was absent from his face. As good as we can be after what went down yesterday. Terrence was the most composed of the group, his arms crossed, staring off into the distance. I've been thinking about what Greg said. He's wrong. He thinks we're replaceable, but we know the truth. We've been the backbone of that shop for years. Without us, it'll fall apart. Luis, however, looked more nervous than ever, his fingers fidgeting with his keys. But what if he really does replace us? What if he brings in a whole new crew, and we're just out? Jamal placed a firm hand on Luis's shoulder. He might try, but he's not going to find guys who can do what we do. We built that shop's reputation. People don't come to Greg's auto repair because of Greg. They come because of us. Carlos nodded in agreement. He'll see that soon enough. The plan they had come up with after leaving Greg's shop the day before was simple, but bold. They weren't going to wait around for Greg to come crawling back to them. They were going to take matters into their own hands. Today, they'd begin looking for a space to open their own shop, a place where they could work on their terms, with no one standing over them telling them they weren't worth their pay. All right, Jamal said, clapping his hands together to focus everyone. Let's get moving. We've got a lot to figure out. They piled into their cars, heading toward the storage unit Miguel had mentioned. It was a few blocks away from Greg's shop, a large, rundown warehouse that looked like it hadn't seen action in years. But as they pulled up, Miguel grinned, pointing out the potential. This is it, he said. My guy said it's been empty for a while, so it's dirt cheap. We can get it for next to nothing. Jamal stepped out of his truck, walking across the cracked concrete floor of the warehouse. It wasn't much to look at, but it had space. More importantly, it had potential. They could set up a couple of lifts, bring in their tools, and start taking jobs right away. Terrence ran a hand along one of the walls, inspecting the space. We'll need to clean it up, but it'll work. Luis, though still nervous, was beginning to show a bit of optimism. We could definitely make this a shop. It's not perfect, But it's ours. Miguel was already running through the numbers in his head. We'll need to pool our savings to get started. But once we get up and running, we can offer lower rates than Greg's and still make a profit. People will come. Jamal was quiet for a moment, taking it all in. This was real now. They weren't just walking away from Greg. They were walking towards something bigger, something that was theirs. We do this, Jamal said, his voice steady. We do it right. No shortcuts. We take pride in what we build here, just like we've always taken pride in our work. Greg doesn't own our skills. We do. The others nodded, the energy shifting from uncertainty to excitement. It was beginning to feel possible. They could make this happen. The walkout wasn't just about leaving Greg's shop behind. It was about building something better. As they left the warehouse and began making calls for equipment and supplies, the weight of their decision started to lift. They weren't waiting for anyone's permission anymore. They were doing this on their terms. That afternoon, the group met at a local cafe to go over their next steps. They sat around a small table, papers spread out in front of them as they mapped out their business plan. Miguel had connections with suppliers who could get them tools and lifts at a discount. Terrence knew a guy who could help with the electrical work in the warehouse. Luis and Carlos were already drafting flyers to pass out to potential customers. We'll have to start small, Jamal said, looking over the notes. But once we get a few jobs under our belt, word will spread. People trust us to do good work. Miguel leaned back in his chair, finally grinning again. Greg's not going to know what hit him. The mood in the cafe was light, a stark contrast to the tension they had felt the day before. Jamal couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in what they were building. This wasn't just about walking away from a bad situation. It was about walking towards something better, something they could control. As they packed up their things and prepared to head out, Terrence slapped Jamal on the back. You did good, man. We wouldn't be doing this without you. Jamal smiled, but his mind was still racing. There was so much left to do, so many unknowns. But for the first time in a long time, he felt in control of his future. They all did. Just doing what needed to be done, Jamal said, shrugging off the praise. We're in this together. They all left the cafe, each of them heading home to their families with a renewed sense of purpose. As Jamal drove home, he thought about the road ahead. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, and there was still the looming question of whether or not Greg would try to retaliate. But it didn't matter now. They had made their decision, and there was no turning back. The walkout wasn't just about leaving Greg behind. It was about taking ownership of their skills, their worth, and their future. And as Jamal pulled into his driveway, he knew one thing for sure. They were on the right path. Tomorrow, they'd get to work building something new, something that belonged to them. The next morning, Jamal stood in front of the warehouse, keys in hand, staring at the massive metal door. It was old, rusted in places, but it felt like the entrance to something new. The air was crisp, and the sun had barely risen, casting an orange glow across the lot. Jamal took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything they were about to undertake. Behind him, Miguel pulled up in his old pickup, honking twice before hopping out. Well, this is it, huh? Day one of the rest of our lives, Miguel said with a grin, tossing his cap onto the dashboard. Jamal smiled. Yeah, this is it. You ready? Miguel nodded as Terrence, Luis, and Carlos arrived one by one, all looking a little more relaxed than they had been the past few days. Each of them greeted Jamal with a nod or a slap on the back as they gathered in front of the warehouse. There was an unspoken sense of purpose in the air. All right, let's see what we've got, Jamal said, unlocking the door. The creaky metal rolled upward, revealing the empty warehouse space. The air inside was musty, and dust hung in the sunlight that filtered through the cracked windows. It wasn't much to look at, but it was theirs. They stepped inside, taking it all in. The floor was concrete, with oil stains from whatever had been stored there before, but it was solid. There was enough room for a couple of lifts, workbenches, and a storage area for tools and spare parts. Terrence, ever the practical one, spoke up first. We'll need to scrub this place down and get some power running to the back if we want to set up the lifts. Miguel was already inspecting the walls. Yeah, but it's not as bad as I thought. It'll clean up pretty easy. I can get the lifts in by the end of the week. Luis, who had been quiet, spoke up. I can call my cousin to help with the electrical. He's a licensed electrician, and he owes me a favor. Jamal nodded, pacing the length of the warehouse, mentally mapping out where everything would go. Let's get the basics set up first. We don't need to be fancy, just functional. We can build up from there. Carlos, always the optimist, rubbed his hands together. Once we get the lifts and tools in here, we'll be up and running in no time. We can start taking jobs right away. Jamal glanced at Carlos, appreciating his enthusiasm. That's the idea, but we need to make sure people know we're open for business. We need flyers, a name, something to get the word out. Miguel raised an eyebrow. What are we calling this place anyway? Jamal hadn't thought about it much. But now that the question was out there, it felt important. This wasn't just a new shop, it was a new start. Let's keep it simple, Jamal said, after a moment of thought. How about Davis Code Auto Repair? It's familiar, and it'll remind people they already know us. Terrence shrugged. Works for me. The name doesn't matter as much as the work we put into it. Luis nodded, jotting the name down in his notepad. I'll get started on the flyers tonight. We can hand them out at the grocery stores, gas stations, anywhere people will see them. Jamal felt a swell of pride. They were doing this, and they were doing it together. The shop might still be an empty warehouse, but it was already coming to life in their minds. The first few days were spent cleaning and setting up. Jamal, Miguel, and Terrence scrubbed down the floors, clearing away years of grime and dust while Carlos and Luis focused on bringing in tools. They worked long hours, not just because they had to, but because they wanted to. Each bucket of water, each wrench they placed on a workbench was a step toward independence. Miguel's friend delivered the lifts by the end of the week, just as promised, and by Friday, they were bolted securely into the concrete. Jamal stood back and admired their work. The space was starting to feel like a real shop, like something they had built with their own hands. As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the warehouse, Jamal gathered the guys around for a quick meeting. They all sat on overturned crates and toolboxes, sweaty and exhausted but smiling. Look at this place, Jamal said, gesturing around. We did this. In less than a week, we turned this empty space into something real. Terrence leaned back on his crate, crossing his arms. We're not done yet, though. We still got to bring in customers. Luis raised his hand, holding up a stack of freshly printed flyers. Already on it. We're passing these out tomorrow morning. We're hitting the grocery store, the gas station on 5th, and anywhere else we can think of. Jamal took one of the flyers from Luis, reading it over. It was simple. Davis Code Auto Repair, quality service, fair prices, your trusted mechanics. Underneath was their address and phone number. This is good, Jamal said, handing the flyer back. Real good, Miguel grinned, wiping the sweat from his forehead. All we need now is that first car to roll in. The next morning, they split up to hand out the flyers. Jamal went to the nearest grocery store, Miguel hit the gas stations, and Carlos went to a nearby car wash. As they passed out the flyers, they could see people recognizing them. Jamal handed a flyer to an older man who nodded in recognition. You worked on my daughter's car at Greg's, didn't you? Jamal smiled. Yeah, that was me. We've opened our own shop now. Come by if you need anything. The man looked at the flyer, nodding. I'll keep that in mind. Good luck, son. By the time they regrouped at the shop in the afternoon, the flyers were nearly gone. They sat around the workbenches, sipping cold water and reflecting on the day's work. People know us, Carlos said, sounding relieved. We're not starting from scratch. Folks already trust us. Jamal nodded. That's what's going to get us through this. Greg might have the building, but we've got the relationships. People know we do good work, and they'll come to us. The next few days were quiet. They busied themselves with more setup, making sure everything was in place for when the customers started coming. Then, one afternoon, the first car pulled up to the warehouse, a beat-up sedan, sputtering as it came to a stop. Jamal's heart raced as he and the others stepped outside to greet the driver, an older woman with a worried expression on her face. Heard you all opened a new shop, she said, clutching the flyer. Car's been giving me trouble for weeks. Thought I'd give you a try. Jamal smiled warmly. You're in the right place. We'll take care of you. They pulled the car into the shop and got to work. The hum of the engine as they diagnosed the problem, the sound of tools hitting the floor. It all felt so familiar, yet completely different. This was theirs now. No one was standing over them, deciding their worth. Every hour they spent working was theirs. As the day came to a close and they sent the woman on her way, her car running smoothly, Jamal felt a surge of pride. This was what they had walked out for. This was the future they had envisioned. They stood together outside the warehouse, watching as the woman's car disappeared down the street. Terrence spoke up, grinning. First of many, Miguel clapped Jamal on the back. We're just getting started. Jamal looked around at the shop, at the men who had stood by his side through it all. He felt the weight of the journey they had been on, but more than that, he felt a deep sense of pride. They had taken control of their future, and no one could take that from them. We've got this, Jamal said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. We've really got this. The others nodded in agreement, and as the sun set over their new shop, they all knew that they had built something far more valuable than just a business. They had built their freedom. Weeks had passed since Jamal and the guys opened Davis Code Auto Repair, and business was picking up faster than they could have imagined. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People knew the quality of work Jamal, Miguel, Terrence, Luis, and Carlos could deliver, and they trusted them. Every day, more cars rolled in, sometimes so many that they barely had time to sit down for lunch. Jamal was working on a transmission when his phone buzzed in his pocket. Wiping his greasy hands on a rag, he glanced at the screen. It was a text from an old customer. someone he'd serviced back when they were all at Greg's shop. "Greg's asking if y'all are hiring," the text read. Jamal snorted, shaking his head in disbelief. He was about to call Miguel over when he heard a voice from the open garage door. Turning around, he saw Greg standing in the doorway, hands on his hips, looking smaller than Jamal had ever seen him. Greg had lost weight, his face hollowed, and his usual confident stride was gone. His shop had been struggling ever since the guys had left. Jamal knew it. Everyone knew it. Customers weren't coming in like they used to. Rumor had it, Greg had tried hiring a new crew of mechanics, but they couldn't keep up with the workload. People wanted the crew they trusted, and that wasn't Greg's new guys. It was Jamal and his team. Miguel spotted Greg too, pausing mid-conversation with a customer to eye him warily. The rest of the guys noticed as well, and a heavy silence fell over the shop. "Jamal!" Greg called, his voice thin and strained. Jamal stood up from under the hood of the car he was working on, wiping his hands again. This time slower, savoring the moment. "What can I do for you, Greg?" Greg's eyes darted around the shop, taking in the bustling activity. Cars on lifts, engines being tuned, mechanics busy with work, his old crew making it all happen without him. Greg swallowed hard, taking a hesitant step forward. "Look, I'll cut to the chase. Things haven't been going well at the shop. You know that." His voice was quieter now, almost pleading. "We could really use you back. All of you." Miguel crossed his arms, leaning against the nearest workbench with a smirk. Luis and Carlos exchanged glances, stifling their amusement. Terrence just watched silently, his face unreadable. Jamal took a deep breath, folding his arms across his chest. "You told us we were replaceable, Greg. What happened to all those new mechanics you hired?" Greg's face reddened slightly. They didn't work out. Not like you guys." Jamal's brow furrowed, though his voice remained calm. "You said we could leave if we didn't like the pay. We did just that. Now here you are." Greg shifted uncomfortably, his hands wringing together. "I made a mistake, all right? I underestimated what you all meant to the shop. I didn't realize—" "You didn't realize we kept your shop running," Jamal interrupted, his voice firm, but not angry. "You didn't value us when we were there. Now that your shop's sinking, you come here asking for help. Why should we go back?" Greg looked desperate now. "I'll pay you what you're worth. More than before. Whatever it takes to get you back." Jamal stared at Greg, taking in the full measure of what he was saying. For a moment, the image of their past flashed in his mind. Years of hard work, being overlooked and underpaid. They had fought for respect, walked away when they weren't given it, and built something better. Now, Greg was standing in their shop, asking for a second chance. Jamal glanced at the guys. Miguel raised an eyebrow, clearly waiting for Jamal to deliver the final word. Terrence was still as a statue, his expression giving nothing away, while Luis and Carlos looked ready to burst out laughing. Jamal turned back to Greg, his voice calm but resolute. "We've already got what we need right here. This is our shop now, Greg. We don't need you." Greg's face fell, but he seemed to push one last time. "Jamal, come on. You guys were like family to me." At that, Miguel let out a short laugh, unable to hold it back. "Family? You sure didn't treat us like family when you were paying us scraps while guys like Eric walked out with raises every few months." Jamal stepped closer to Greg, his tone never rising, but his words sharp and clear. "You had your chance to treat us right. We walked out because you didn't value us. We're not going back." Greg's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he looked like he might argue again, but something in his eyes shifted, and the fight seemed to drain out of him. He turned, glancing back at the bustling shop, realizing just how much he had lost. "All right," Greg muttered, barely audible. "All right." Without another word, he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the quiet that had settled over the shop. As Greg disappeared from view, Miguel let out a long whistle. "That was something." Carlos shook his head, grinning. "I can't believe he actually came here, thinking we'd go back." Terrence finally spoke, his deep voice cutting through the laughter. "He's desperate, and that's what happens when you don't treat people right." Jamal watched the doorway where Greg had stood, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of him had wanted this moment, to see Greg humbled, to have the last laugh. But now that it had happened, he didn't feel the need to gloat. They had won. That was enough. He turned back to the car he'd been working on, grabbing his tools. "All right, let's get back to work. We've got cars to fix." The others laughed, the tension of the moment fading as they went back to their tasks. Jamal ducked under the hood of the car, but a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. They had built something better, something stronger than Greg ever could have given them. And now, they were running the show. As the day wore on, more cars rolled into the shop and the sounds of work filled the air again. Jamal looked around, watching his crew, his friends, move with confidence and purpose. They weren't just mechanics anymore. They were owners, builders of their own future. Greg's shop might survive, or it might not. But Jamal knew one thing for sure. Davis Cumber Auto Repair wasn't going anywhere. They had earned every bit of success they were now enjoying, and they were going to keep building on it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the shop, Jamal stood outside, taking it all in. The warehouse, once empty and dusty, was now a bustling business, filled with the hum of machines and the laughter of men who had taken control of their destiny. The last laugh wasn't a moment. It wasn't just about Greg's visit. It was everything they had done to get here, every step they had taken to break free from the chains of underappreciation. Jamal smiled, turning back to the shop. They had built something real, something lasting, and no one could take that from them. They had the last laugh, and it felt better than he could have ever imagined.